The morning mist hung thick over Charleston harbor, curling in gray tendrils around the wooden pilings and tugboats, hiding the distant sails of incoming ships. Baron Wilhelm Hargrave, a man who had purchased both title and reputation more than a decade ago, strode along the cobbled streets with a measured determination. The letter he had received the night before had unsettled him more than any creditor's demand or rival's insult. It promised secrets long buried would surface, and with them, consequences he was not prepared to face. His destination was the auction house in the commercial district, a place where wealth and ambition were displayed openly, and where fortunes were exchanged with the simple turn of a pen. Today, however, he was not here to buy cotton or land, nor to settle accounts. Today he was buying a child, a girl small and fragile, yet burdened by a significance he could not yet define. She was to be a gift for his daughter Constance, a girl raised in silk and music, untouched by the harsher realities of the world. Wilhelm's reflection caught in the shop windows as he walked. His face, once sharp and commanding, had softened with age and indulgence. Gray streaked through his once dark hair, and the folds around his eyes deepened with years of calculation and care. Yet his eyes remained piercing, scanning, as if searching for the truth hidden behind every shadowed corner. He carried the air of a man who had learned long ago that appearances were everything, and yet nothing could prepare him for the shock of recognition awaiting him that evening. The auction was brief. Papers were signed, witnesses nodded, and the transaction was recorded with meticulous precision. Legally, there could be no dispute. Yet when the girl was brought to the Hargrave residence that evening, she did not enter as a mere possession. She stepped into the grand hall barefoot, her small hands folded in front of her, her dark eyes lowered. And in that moment, every servant paused mid-step, the household falling into an uneasy silence. There was something in her features, something impossible to ignore. The shape of her eyes, the subtle curve of her lips, the set of her jaw. Baron Wilhelm froze. His wife, Margaret, pale and brittle in appearance, could not contain herself. She staggered backward and grasped the nearest chair for support. Constance, the porcelain daughter who had known nothing but wealth and order, let out a startled cry. The girl standing before them bore a striking resemblance to the Baron himself as a child, a likeness so precise it could not have been mere coincidence. Eliza, as she had been named, did not raise her head immediately. Her hands remained folded, her small frame trembling in the evening chill. Yet when she finally lifted her gaze, her dark, intelligent eyes met Wilhelm's, and for the first time in years he felt an unfamiliar pang of unease. The child's eyes seemed to see more than the room around her. They seemed to see him, his secrets, the shadows of choices long buried. Margaret's voice broke the silence. "She must not be allowed to disrupt the order of this house," she said, her tone brittle with fear and authority. "Constance must learn her place in society, and this girl, whatever her background, must understand hers." Wilhelm nodded slowly, but inside, a storm of unease raged. Legally, the girl was property. Socially, she was a servant. Yet the resemblance gnawed at him, the resemblance and something else. A certainty, unspoken and heavy. It was as if the past itself had come to claim its due. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the harbor in streaks of blood orange and purple, Wilhelm Hargrave could not eat. He sat alone in his study, listening to the distant strains of Constance's piano practice and the quiet shuffle of servants' feet on polished floors. The girl had arrived, and with her came a quiet reckoning, an invisible thread connecting her to secrets that would not remain buried. And in that quiet, Wilhelm knew that the evening's arrival was more than a gift. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The night settled over the Hargrave estate like a velvet shroud, the wind rustling through the garden hedges and carrying the faint scent of salt from the harbor. Inside, the household seemed calm, but the silence was brittle, filled with unspoken tension. The servants moved carefully, their eyes lingering on the girl who now occupied a small, sparsely furnished room at the end of the east wing. Eliza had been bathed, fed, and dressed in the plain gray gown that marked her status, yet she carried herself with a dignity that unsettled even the most seasoned house staff. Wilhelm Hargrave remained in his study long after the household had retired, staring at the flickering fire in the hearth. The resemblance was undeniable. The girl's dark eyes, her delicate bone structure, the faint curl of her lips, all mirrored features Wilhelm had long thought buried in memory. How had fate contrived this, bringing a fragment of the past into the heart of his home? He could not answer. The weight of it pressed on his chest, a constant reminder that some truths, once unearthed, could never be concealed again. Meanwhile, in the parlor, Margaret moved through her embroidery with measured precision, her hands shaking slightly despite her composed exterior. She had spent the evening observing the interactions between Constance and the girl, noting the innocent curiosity in her daughter's eyes and the quiet restraint in Eliza's. There was a subtle intelligence in the child's gaze, a patience and awareness far beyond her years. Margaret's mind raced, recalling lessons she had learned long ago. Appearances must be maintained, order preserved, and the household's reputation shielded from any hint of scandal. Yet beneath her controlled demeanor, a seed of unease had taken root. Constance, oblivious to the tension, had remained at the piano longer than usual, her fingers tracing the melancholy notes of the nocturne. She glanced at the door several times, anticipating Eliza's presence. When the girl finally entered, Constance's face lit with excitement. "Come, Eliza," she whispered. "Let me show you the music. You'll play with me." Eliza's hands trembled slightly, but she obeyed, placing her small fingers delicately on the keys. The contrast between her humility and the precision with which she struck each note fascinated Wilhelm, who had lingered at the doorway unnoticed. In the kitchen, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, watched the girl with a careful eye. She had been instructed to guide Eliza gently, to avoid drawing undue attention, yet even she could not ignore the uncanny resemblance to the master of the house. The other servants whispered in corners, speculating on the child's origin, exchanging stories they would later deny. There was something almost aristocratic in the way Eliza carried herself, something that suggested not a common servant but a presence born of refinement, even if circumstances had forced her into the role of an attendant. By midnight, Wilhelm had retired to his private study once more. The letter from the blackmailer still lay on the desk, a silent accusation in ink and paper. He knew that the moment he allowed curiosity to dominate caution, the consequences could be ruinous. Yet the child, Eliza, haunted him more than the threat itself. Every detail of her face, her posture, her quiet intelligence seemed to speak of truths that could unravel carefully constructed lives. How much did she know? How much had been intentionally hidden, and how much would the world eventually uncover? He could not decide. Outside, the wind grew stronger, rattling the tall windows of the mansion. The shadows of the trees stretched like long fingers across the polished floors. Within the house, every footstep, every whisper seemed amplified. The arrival of the girl had awakened forces no one had anticipated, the echoes of past indiscretions, the weight of secrets, and the fragile equilibrium of a household built on appearances. And as Wilhelm sat alone in the flickering candlelight, he realized that the house itself had changed. Nothing would remain the same. The girl had come, a stranger in name only, carrying within her the power to unearth truths that generations had labored to conceal. In the silence, the first tremors of consequence began to stir, quiet but unstoppable. Dawn broke over the Hargrave estate, pale sunlight filtering through the tall windows and casting long, cold shadows across the marble floors. The household stirred, each servant performing their duties with careful precision, yet beneath the routine, an undercurrent of tension pulsed like a heartbeat. Eliza moved silently through the halls, her dark eyes alert, noting every whisper, every glance, every unspoken fear. She had learned quickly that the world she now entered was one of hidden rules, where appearances were everything, and curiosity could be dangerous. Constance, oblivious to the subtle undercurrents of unease, had taken to shadowing Eliza, her fascination mingled with possessive pride. The girl's intelligence and grace had captivated her, and yet, in the fleeting moments when she thought herself unseen, Constance caught hints of a quiet dignity in Eliza that set her apart from any servant she had known. It was in the way she carried herself, in the precision of her movements, and most of all in her eyes that seemed to hold knowledge beyond her years. Baron Wilhelm Hargrave remained uneasy. He had spent the night turning over the events of the previous evening, considering the implications of the girl's arrival. Something about her struck him as more than coincidence. The resemblance, though subtle in daylight, lingered in his mind. He avoided looking too long, yet he could not stop himself. The faint curl of her mouth, the set of her jaw, even the tilt of her head, each detail brought memories of a childhood long suppressed. He had thought that part of his life buried, hidden behind the barriers of wealth, title, and secrecy. Now it was standing before him, silent and observing. By mid-morning, Wilhelm found himself in the library, leafing through old ledgers and letters he had not examined for years. Dust rose in the shafts of sunlight as he moved from shelf to shelf. Most of the documents were routine, land transactions, shipping receipts, correspondence with merchants. But buried beneath the mundane lay something more personal. A collection of letters tied to a distant relative, a name long forgotten, hints of alliances and betrayals that had been carefully obscured. and most unsettling of all, references to a girl. Her name never directly written, but enough clues to make the mind of any careful observer race. Eliza, meanwhile, explored the quieter parts of the estate. She had begun to notice the locked doors and hidden compartments, the hushed conversations abruptly cut off when she approached. She did not speak of it, but her curiosity sharpened. The staff, though polite, seemed wary of her. Even Constance, in her youthful excitement, occasionally cast a worried glance at her new companion, as if sensing the tension without understanding its source. It was a delicate balance, friendship built on trust, yet shadowed by secrecy. That afternoon, a servant whispered to Wilhelm in hushed tones about a visitor, a courier bearing news from Savannah, with urgent papers and letters. The Baron took them to his study and carefully examined their contents. They spoke of old estates, legal claims, and matters of inheritance long considered settled, and buried within the mundane legalities was a thread that connected directly to the girl. Wilhelm's pulse quickened. The child who had arrived so innocently was not merely a servant or companion. She carried with her a legacy that could alter the fate of the Hargrave family, unraveling reputations and exposing truths that had been buried for decades. By evening, the tension had spread through the household like a creeping fog. Even Margaret, poised and composed as ever, could not fully mask her concern. She watched Wilhelm closely, noting the subtle changes in his demeanor, the way he lingered on documents and letters, the way his sharp gaze occasionally softened when Eliza entered the room. Margaret understood instinctively that the household's fragile order was threatened, not by violence or open scandal, but by the quiet persistence of truth, carried in the presence of one small, unassuming girl. And in the dim light of the study, Baron Wilhelm Hargrave realized that no amount of wealth, power, or careful planning could contain what had arrived on his doorstep. The girl was more than a gift. She was a reckoning, a shadow of the past intruding into the present, and the first stirrings of a story that would change everything. The morning light filtered weakly through the tall windows of the Hargrave estate, casting a pallid glow over the grand hall. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the ancient oaks, their shadows shifting across the polished floors. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with unease. The arrival of Eliza had unsettled the household more than anyone cared to admit, and the subtle fractures in the veneer of order were beginning to show. Wilhelm sat at his desk in the study, letters spread before him like an open map of the past. Each document was a piece of the puzzle he had long avoided assembling. Handwritten ledgers, faded ink, and folded notes, all containing traces of stories better left forgotten. But the resemblance between Eliza and himself had made avoidance impossible. He could no longer pretend the past had no bearing on the present. The girl's presence demanded acknowledgement, and each letter he read seemed to confirm the unspoken truth. She was connected to him in a way society would never forgive, and history had a way of catching up even the most careful of men. Meanwhile, Eliza moved through the household with quiet grace, observing without intruding. She had already learned to anticipate the unspoken rules of the house, the delicate hierarchy of servants, the careful rituals of the family, the small gestures that indicated approval or disapproval. Yet even as she observed, she could not ignore the tension that seemed to cling to the Baron. His glances, fleeting but deliberate, carried a weight she could not place. And though she had been instructed to behave like a companion to Constance, a shadow of something larger lingered over her presence, a mystery in which she was both participant and subject. Constance, for her part, remained blissfully unaware of the implications surrounding her new friend. She delighted in showing Eliza the finer things of her world, the piano, the music lessons, the elaborate gardens that stretched beyond the estate walls. Yet there were moments when Constance paused mid-sentence, noting the way Wilhelm's gaze followed Eliza, or how Margaret's eyes seemed to harden at the slightest infraction. These moments passed quickly, but they planted seeds of curiosity that would grow in time. That afternoon, Wilhelm made his way to a small, locked room on the third floor, a space he rarely entered. Dust motes danced in the slanting light as he retrieved a bundle of letters and journals tied with a faded ribbon. Sitting alone at the desk, he unfolded them carefully, as though the fragile pages might crumble under the weight of their contents. The handwriting was precise, elegant, and unmistakably familiar in tone. The letters spoke of arrangements, promises and obligations made long ago, secrets whispered in confidence and meant to be kept from the world. And buried within the carefully worded sentences was a truth that could not be denied. The girl Eliza was more than a servant. She carried the legacy of the past in her very being. Margaret entered quietly, her presence a sharp contrast to the oppressive silence of the study. "Wilhelm," she said softly, "these letters, They confirm what we feared. You know as well as I do the danger if this were to be revealed. We cannot let Constance or anyone else in society discover the truth." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her gloves. "We must handle this delicately. The child. She must never understand fully, at least not yet." Wilhelm nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. The weight of responsibility pressed upon him. Eliza was clever, perceptive, far beyond what one might expect for a girl of her age and upbringing. To keep the household's secret would require vigilance, restraint, and careful planning. And yet, as he glanced at the girl's folded hands, the steady calm in her dark eyes, he felt the faintest tug of recognition. The resemblance was no longer just physical. It was in her manner, in the quiet intelligence that mirrored his own. The evening drew on, and the household settled into uneasy routines. But the presence of the letters, the unspoken tension, and the girl's quiet dignity had begun to shift the balance of power within the house. Secrets that had been locked away for decades were beginning to stir, and as Wilhelm extinguished the candles in his study, he knew that the true reckoning was only just beginning. The night was deep, and the wind howled along the edges of the Hargrave estate, like a mournful warning. Within the grand house, shadows flickered in the candlelight, stretching long and uncertain across the polished floors. Eliza sat quietly in her room, the events of the past days pressing in on her. Though she had learned much of the household's routines, much of what she sensed remained unspoken, hidden behind closed doors, glances, and hushed conversations. And yet, the pieces were beginning to fit together in her mind, forming a picture that none of the Hargraves could anticipate. Wilhelm Hargrave, unable to sleep, returned once more to the study, letters clutched in his hand. Each paper told a fragment of a story, and each fragment led inexorably to a truth that had long been concealed. The resemblance had been no accident. The girl he had purchased, intended as a gift for his daughter, carried the blood of a life he had tried to leave behind. Secrets, once dormant, were waking. The ledger entries, the letters, the careful notations, they all confirmed it. Eliza was his daughter, born of circumstances society demanded be hidden. And now the quiet, perceptive child he had underestimated held the power to unravel the careful order he had maintained for decades. Margaret entered silently, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. "Wilhelm," she whispered, "we cannot undo this. We must decide how to manage what is already done." Her voice trembled only slightly. "She is clever. She will sense more than we realize. We must tread carefully." The Baron nodded slowly, realizing that the balance of the household, the perception of society, and the family's fragile reputation rested precariously on decisions he could no longer fully control. Eliza, though young, had the wisdom of observation, the sharpness of intellect, and the uncanny ability to read those around her. When Eliza was called into the parlor that evening, she approached with the poise of someone who had long observed the nuances of power, even without speaking a word. Constance, bright and oblivious to the underlying tension, greeted her warmly, unaware that the child before her was more than a servant or companion. The air hung thick, charged with unspoken questions and the weight of truths not yet named. Wilhelm, finally speaking, broke the silence. "Eliza, there are things you do not know about this house, about this family, truths that have been carefully hidden. Yet you are a part of them, in ways we cannot deny." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Eliza's dark eyes, calm and intelligent, met his, as if silently acknowledging the significance without speaking. The realization of identity, of connection, hung between them, unspoken yet undeniable. The following days saw subtle shifts in the household. Constance remained joyful, absorbed in music and games, yet careful glances showed her noticing the quiet respect the staff now afforded Eliza. Margaret and Wilhelm adjusted, learning to navigate the delicate balance of secrecy, while the child herself moved through the rooms with the quiet authority of someone who had quietly claimed her place in the world. In time, the Hargrave estate settled into a new rhythm. The girl, once an outsider, became a presence that commanded attention without asking for it. Her intelligence, dignity, and quiet power reshaped the household in ways no one could have predicted. The past, though still shadowed, had found a vessel in her, and the future, fragile and uncertain, was forever altered. And as the candlelight flickered across the polished floors that night, Wilhelm Hargrave made a silent promise. The past would remain hidden, but it would never be forgotten. Some truths, he realized, could no longer be buried, yet they could be managed with patience, care, and respect for the lives touched by them. If you enjoyed this dark story of secrets, hidden legacies, and historical intrigue, Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell so you don't miss our weekly deep dives into dark history, where we uncover the stories that have haunted the past for centuries.